According to the real experts, the people who study the impact of grief and loss on the body and on the brain, one of the healthiest ways to cope with grief and move through the hardest parts of loss is something called the continuing bonds theory, which essentially argues that we should all find a way to continue our bond, our relationship with the deceased after death. And that can and should look different for everyone.
Hello, and welcome to Grief, Gratitude, and the Gray in Between podcast. This podcast is about exploring the grief that occurs at different times in our lives, in which we have had major changes and transitions that literally shake us to the core and make us experience grief. I created this podcast for people to feel a little less hopeless and alone in their own grief process as they hear the stories of others who have had similar journeys. I'm Kendra Rinaldi, your host. Now, let's dive right into today's episode.
I have been asked by many people what I use to record my podcast. I have been using Zencastr since I launched my podcast in March 2020, and it has made it so simple for me to be able to interview my guests remotely as well as do some of my solo episodes. If you have thought about podcasting before and realize that you need a lot of different tools and services, those days are over. With Zencastr's all-in-one podcasting platform, you can create your podcast all in one place and distribute to Spotify, Apple, and any other major destination. Go to zencastr.com/pricing and use my code GGG podcast, and you'll get 30% off your first month of Zencastr's paid plan. That is Zencastr, ZENCASTR.com/pricing. And again, the code is GGG podcast. Can't wait for you to get started and be able to tune into your next podcast. Welcome to today's episode. Today I have Marisa Renee Lee. She is a writer, a speaker, and entrepreneur. And we will be talking today about her book, Grief is Love, and all the stories of her life and her own journey that really brought her to be able to be in this space of writing about grief and also now talking about grief. So welcome, Marisa.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here today.
I am excited for this conversation, and I love the title of your book, and it's something that I've heard now even more often, that of even people quoting actors. The most recent one is probably one, what's his name? Andrew
Yes,
Garfield,
yes,
right?
I
Is that
saw
what
it. So
that?
beautiful.
Yeah, when he talked about that and kind of saying it in that way, and it is such a perfect way of saying it. So again, thank you for being on the podcast, and we will just jump right into just chatting. So tell us first off, I know it's kind of sounds odd of where I start my conversation, but where do you
Go.
live and where did you grow up?
So I live in the Hudson Valley, and I grew up in the Hudson Valley in New
So,
York,
so you stayed
which,
in.
yeah, well, I didn't stay. I left, I graduated from college and took a year off to help my mom and dad deal with my mom's health diagnoses. And then I lived in New York City, and then I moved to DC and lived in the DC area for 12 years. And after, pandemic and really thinking about where we want to be and who we want to be close to, and then, as I'm sure you can attest, once you have these little humans called children, it is nice to be close to family, assuming you can access some of their free labor, which is exactly what we came here to do. So this week, my son will be with my dad one day, he'll be with my sister another day, and that just makes our lives easier.
Okay, well that is definitely helpful. I know we moved closer to our parents, to my parents when we had the young little
Yeah.
ones. So, but something that you actually say in your book that I think it even goes into the part of parenting is that the chapter of ask.
Oh,
I was not
girl.
that good at asking for help. So that can relate with parenting as well.
Oh, I think that asking for help is advice for anybody all the time. Like, it doesn't your life doesn't have to be falling apart in some big dramatic way for you to get some help taking care of your kids. I'm currently reading this book called Hunt, Gather, Parent that is all about the ways different ancient cultures that are still around today raise children and all the lessons that you can glean from that. And one of the things that she talks about a lot in this book is this concept of allo parents, like additional parents and other adults in a child's life who can love them and support them and help nurture and guide them into adulthood. And I just think that's so important.
Yeah, that the village component of
Yeah,
raising yeah, and it's
it's
true, it does
real.
take a village, and it really does make a big difference in an upbringing of a human being of a to
Yes.
know that you have this circle that it's much bigger, and especially when it comes to the aspect of grief,
Yes.
because when, let's say, let's say you're an only child and you've only grown up with 2 adults in your family, both die, then all of a sudden you're like, "Who's
What
my
do
village
you
now? Who do I
Yeah.
reach out to now?" Right? Or
Yep.
vice versa, it could be the case. So, it is definitely important to have that community around in all aspects of life. So that's great
Yes.
that you're there. And that part right before we started recording, Marissa said, "Oh, and so my son will be coming." I'm like, "Wait, did I miss that in the book?" I'm like, "We talk about other parts of grief in this book because you talk about navigating several types of grief. One that was your mom's diagnosis of multiple sclerosis since you were the age of 13. Correct. So you carried, cared for her as well
Yep.
since you were young, as well as then afterwards her diagnosis of her cancer diagnosis, as and then you also then talk about the aspect of then your pregnancy losses. So there was all these different facets, and you intertwined all of that really beautifully in your
Well,
book
thank
because
you.
you mention it in all of your chapters, which I'll go over that of the titles of your chapters. You intertwine all of the grief aspects in them. So you've really had a broad experience of grief,
Unfortunately.
and yet you're still not an expert. I think that every all of us, even if we experience grief, we're still not experts, are we?
Nope,
Nope.
nope, nope, nope. I don't think so because at the end of the day, to me, being an expert also, I think, denotes some element of control. Like, if you are an expert surgeon, that means when shit hits the fan, you're going to be able to control and effectively manage the situation. I know a lot about grief. I've conducted a lot of research on grief and loss. I unfortunately have experienced lots of different forms of grief and loss. But I am telling you right now, if something horrible were to happen to my husband or, heaven forbid, my child tomorrow, like, all of that education, it will just melt away. Like, it disappears.
And not only about ourselves, but the fact that something we know when we experience grief is that it is very unique, right? Not
Yes.
the way you
Yes.
experience it is different than your sister, the different than your
Yep.
dad. Therefore, you really can't be an expert because you do not know the nuances of somebody
Yes.
else's grief. So, but you have a perspective and you have some tools, and hence why I interview people on the podcast that give people an insight as to, okay, if I've already gathered all these tools and have this information, then when, as you say, shit hits the fan,
Yeah.
you can see, okay, what works for me right now, what could be something that I can apply once you're already rational, because
Fair.
it does
Fair.
not
It's a really good
necessarily happen.
point.
Yeah. So let's go through why you chose. This is going to be a little bit of everything. Why you chose the titles you did through each of the through the book. So you have permission, safety, feel, ask, grace, intimacy, care, and legacy, and then love. So 10 chapters. And within each one, there's a lot in each one. So how did you come up with like, okay, this one, all this will be permission. Like, how was that process?
It was messy, and hard. This was my first book. I didn't know what I was doing, and I'm happy to share that with people because I want folks to know that you don't have to have it all figured out in order to make progress on something that matters to you. And so I turned in May of 2021. I turned in a manuscript for Grief is Love that I was proud of, but looking back, it wasn't the right book, and it took me about 2 months to figure that out. But after my editor had a chance to review it and we discussed it, and we were both like, there's some really good stuff in here, but something is wrong. Like, what is it? And I actually went on a silent retreat that summer, and while I was there, not reading, not listening to anything, not speaking to anyone, it hit me all of a sudden. The original manuscript was a book all about grief. And what I actually needed to write a book about was healing. When people see me in my hot pink office or laughing at an event or, smiling, hanging out with friends, they're like, how do you hold both this tremendous grief and loss and all of this, joy and fun and energy and enthusiasm? And so I made myself sit down and think about, what are the different elements that have enabled me to live this big, joyful life after, and sometimes even in the midst of, grief and loss. And that was sort of the new framing for the book that I started rewriting like right around July 4th weekend, and it was due Labor Day. And so I scrapped, I would say at least 60% of the original manuscript, maybe more. Like, even now, even though the book is done and no one's going to make me go back and rewrite anything, it still gives me anxiety to admit that that much of the book had to be thrown out. But that's just how it goes with writing books. And so I was working on the revised manuscript when one day in August, my husband and I got a call and we became parents in less than 24 hours. And all of a sudden, I found myself, both parenting a newborn, which was amazing, the greatest joy, but also one of the most exhausting human experiences while trying to run my business and finish this book. So when you ask about the titles for me were ingredients on my healing journey, and they were the things that I found were also rooted in the leading research and evidence and data around grief and loss that generally help people. Everyone's roadmap is going to be a little bit different, and I expect certain chapters to resonate more with different individuals versus others. But at the end of the day, all of these chapters and all of these things both let me live this big and joyful life, but they are also supported by the leading research and data around grief and loss and healing and racism.
Okay, yes, because that is another part that you also intertwine in your book is this aspect that as a Black woman, to like what is expected of you, or even just the generational, kind of
Yeah.
trauma, as well as just the upbringing that comes with it, how that even impacted the way that you grieved. So, if we can talk about that, let's talk about how it was for you to actually be able to feel and express your grief, and how you actually would hide your grief because of what was expected to some extent by society or those around you.
Yeah, I when my mom died, I had just turned 25. I was working on Wall Street at the height of the financial crisis, and it was 2008 Wall Street. So generally I was the only person of color. I won't even say black, like the only person of color of any kind, and often the only woman, and usually the youngest person in the room. And so, with all of that in mind, I was really thoughtful and intentional about how I presented myself in that environment. And emotional vulnerability, not only was it just not something that was celebrated generally, this was the time before the Brene Browns and Glennon Doyles and all of these other female leaders that encourage us to lean into our feelings and emotions. This wasn't that time. And so I felt uncomfortable, openly sharing grief at work. It was one thing to talk about my mom in a factual way, because people would definitely ask, how is she doing? How are you doing? What is going on? And I could give the talking points on, where she was in terms of her disease progression, how she was being treated, how I was supporting her, doctors she was seeing, etc. But I did not want people asking me about my feelings because I didn't feel comfortable sharing them there. And then when she died, I didn't have any other plan for taking care of myself financially. And so I went back to work right away, and it was horrible. Every day I could get myself dressed and out the door, usually on 3 to 4 hours sleep. And then it was when I would leave the subway in New York City, climbing up those subway stairs and doing the walk from the station to my office, I would start having the most debilitating panic attacks, like could barely breathe type situation. And so every morning I would manage to like get to the building where the bank was, and I would go down to the basement where we had a training center that was usually empty, and that is where I would just have a complete like hyperventilating panic attack. And then I would text the only other girl in banking, who thankfully had become a friend and was only a year or so older than me, and she would come rescue me with soy latte and a Xanax from my desk. I would redo my makeup and then go up to work as though nothing had happened. And I didn't even, until I was doing the research for Grief is Love, I didn't even know how long I lived like that for. But I asked her, and she said it was definitely months and not weeks. So please don't anyone do that to yourself. Panic attacks are a normal part of the grieving process for some people. Anxiety is a very normal part of grief for a lot of people, but just get better help than I did. You don't have to suffer day in and day out with debilitating panic attacks as you're trying to make your way through the worst of grief and continue on with your life.
Yeah, you mentioned had it been like 13 years or so later that you thought that you had already was it about when you went and did like somatic therapy?
Oh yeah,
How
yeah,
many
yeah,
years?
yeah. It was
And
it was
that
about 12 or 13. You're right.
12,
You're absolutely
12
right.
or 13 that you then also seek then for other therapy because you realize that one of the ways that you were processing grief was through anger being one of these
Yeah,
emotions. So talk about that aspect of the grief, how anger holds a space
yeah,
and at the same time the love, again,
yeah.
there's so many dualities in grief and you even shared about
So
laughter. Yeah.
yes, yes to all. So Kendra, think about this. Are you married?
Yes,
who
yes.
who is the person in your life who can make you the angriest?
Oh yeah,
Like,
yeah. Of course. The ones that are the
like,
close. Yeah.
yes, it's like the people we love, and it's true for all of us. Like the people we love the most, whether it's our spouses, our children, our parents, our siblings, like those are also the people we come closest to like wringing their neck, and that can like really get under our skin and just make us so mad. And the same thing can happen even if the person is no longer here. And I want people to know that. And I want to normalize anger as a part of grief. Because for me, I have so much active love for my mom. Just last week was 16 years since she died. And I will never stop loving that woman. My son is being raised to love this woman. Like she was truly a wonderful mom. You can ask all sorts of people, not just me. She was a great mom, great person, great friend, etc. And she was also human. And for bereaved children in particular, there are often feelings of anger and abandonment because at the end of the day, obviously it wasn't her fault that she had MS and then she got stage 4 breast cancer. But at the end of the day, I'm still a kid and my mom left. Like that, like there is a really primitive part in our brains that understands any sort of loss as a form of abandonment. And so anger is very natural. And at the time, I was angry because, first of all, we were in the middle of the pandemic, which was just rage inducing and miserable and hard on all of us for a myriad of reasons. I had just experienced about a year earlier a devastating pregnancy loss, and my husband and I were in the adoption process. And it just felt like we were never going to become parents. We were almost 5 years into our parenthood journey at that point. And I was also still very physically sick from the pregnancy loss and some underlying hormone health issues that I have. So, like, I had a lot of reasons to be angry at the time. And not having my mom there to comfort me, to guide me, to support me, it made me really mad. And thankfully, through this therapy experience, I was able to work through that. And so, if you feel like there is something that is weighing you down, or there is something that you are holding on to, and you can't quite wrap your mind around it or figure out what it is or how to get it out of your body, I just want to encourage people to seek more help. We're not supposed to know how to do all of these things. Like, we're not. And so it was through this therapy session and like deep meditation that I was able to get at what was really going on in my body and in my mind, and then get it out. The only thing I say this in Grief is Love, and I try to say it every time I talk to people about grief and loss, the only thing we know about emotions based on science is that they are fleeting, they are impermanent. And the only thing that gives them less control over us is naming them. So give yourself space to feel whatever it is and to name it and to be okay with it, because that is how you're going to move through it.
It's so important to normalize. Again, first off, we're normalizing the conversation around grief, we're normalizing the
Yeah.
conversation around death, and we're normalizing all these aspects that come with grief, and not judging others by how they're grieving either, but at the same time allowing that space to feel. Because if society doesn't talk about grief, then people, for example, like yourself, you went back to work, you didn't even take time off from work probably right after that, as enough time, or even there's really isn't even enough time, because what if you have a
True.
grief episode 10 years down the line? Do people in a work environment even know how to navigate their own staff going through grief too, right?
Yep.
So
Yep.
yeah, and how it shows up is very different. It could show up as that laughter. You mentioned how didn't you laugh in the oh
Oh
yes,
yeah.
yes, yes,
Oh
yes.
yeah.
Oh, is it okay to talk about that little
Oh yeah.
scenario? I don't want to
Go for
just
it.
give it. Okay, so no, you share about what happened then at the funeral. Okay, actually here, let's see how much I can remember.
Okay.
So one thing you guys knew for sure, your mom loved gospel music,
Mhm.
right? And
Mhm.
soulful music. And you knew you wanted this really beautiful
Yeah. Oh yeah.
presentation and song. Now I forgot which song it was now that I forgot. Oh yeah, right on the mountain, was it? No.
His eyes on
His
the
eye
sparrow.
his eyes on the sparrow. Yeah, his eyes on the sparrow. And then that the pastor said, "Oh, I have somebody perfect,
Oh my
perfect
god.
for the part for
Oh
to
my
sing."
god, she was
And go
so
ahead.
bad.
You go
To
from there.
this day, I mean, this was now 16 years ago. To this day, I have never heard a worse performance. I don't know that I ever will in my life. It was almost as if, if someone is like intentionally singing in a way to make fun of someone or make fun of something, like
Yeah,
that
yeah.
was what it felt like. And we're sitting in, the front row of the church. My mom's casket, open casket, is, 10 feet away or whatever. And it was so bad that we all started laughing and, like, trying to do it quietly and not be terrible human beings. But it was me, my cousin, who's one of those people who laughs when people get
Like
hurt.
the
So, like, she
inappropriate,
was
yeah.
not quiet. Yeah, she
Inappropriate
was the
laughter,
worst.
yeah.
My sister, and then my grandmother trying to tell us to like stop laughing, but she was also kind of laughing herself. It was so bad. And I share that story because, then minutes later, literally minutes later, the funeral is over and they're about to take my mom's body out of the sanctuary. And like, I get to see her one last time. And completely lose it. And so I want people to give themselves permission to laugh and experience joy when it comes up for you and not feel guilty about it or feel like, oh, okay, so I had a good laugh. I must be good now. And I want to make sure other people don't see folks who are living with loss or in deep grief have a good time and think that they're suddenly over it and they
Mhm.
don't need to keep checking in on them or asking about the person they lost, etc. Like, can we normalize the full range of the human experience? It doesn't have to be just sadness or just joy. And for me, and I know you said your kids are in high school now, but I'm sure you remember this. Every time my toddler goes from completely losing his shit over whatever to laughing and smiling and saying, Mama, I love you so much. Within 30 seconds,
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, so this is how we show up in the
Jekyll
world.
and Hyde.
Yeah, it is
Jekyll.
it is so wild. And
Yeah.
so for me, being around this child is a reminder that life is more like up and down and all around emotionally, not just very direct and prescripted and one or the other. It is very much both and.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's not linear. It is a
Yeah.
roller coaster. It's ebbs and
Yes.
flows. There's so many different ways of describing this array of emotions that show up. And again, as you were mentioning before, you can hold them in both hands simultaneously, both emotions at the
Yep.
same time in
Yep.
the problem.
Yep.
So regarding the part of connecting then, because in that moment when you laughed, you in at the funeral, there was something about it that was also just you were feeling like, how am I gonna even live after this loss?
Yep.
Yet
Mhm.
that release of emotion and laughter was a reminder that you felt was kind of like a little tap on the shoulder from your mom of you'll be
Totally.
okay. So talk about that part of how do we live in this world? How are you living in this world? Still bringing her into your life because that's been something you've had to do even now after you met your now husband is how do you bring someone into your life that did not know the person that raised you and who meant so much to you. Anyway, I asked too many things at the same time.
It's
Just
okay.
but
No, it's
you
okay. I get where you're
you
at.
get
Yes.
it. You
How do
get it.
you
Okay.
continue to bring them along? Yeah. So first of all, I just again to keep us grounded in the research that's in the book, I came to believe before looking into the research that this whole concept we have around grief, where we look for people to get over it and move on, I felt like that was wrong. It was 11 years after my mom died when we had our last really bad pregnancy loss. And all I wanted in that moment, curled up on like a tiny bath mat in our master bathroom, couldn't even pick my head up off the floor. I was so sick. All I wanted was my mom. And I have an amazing husband, by the way, but like I all I wanted was my mom. And so I ended up writing an article in May of 2020 that went somewhat viral based on this concept, like that the idea of getting over it is foolish and that I'm never going to get over it. And I don't care what anybody else thinks. And that resonated with people and became the foundation of Grief is Love. And as I was doing the research for the book, what I learned is, according to the real experts, the people who study the impact of grief and loss on the body and on the brain, one of the healthiest ways to cope with grief and move through the hardest parts of loss is something called the continuing bonds theory, which essentially argues that we should all find a way to continue our bond, our relationship with the deceased after death. And that can and should look different for everyone. I know in our family, what I decide to do is very different from what my dad does, which is very different from what my sister does and doesn't do. And so I don't want people to feel like there's only one way to do this, but in my experience and leveraging the research, there's a multitude of ways to think about how you continue to have a relationship with your person when they're no longer here. So one of them is just simply like honoring your grief and giving yourself permission to grieve and accepting whatever feelings come up. So that's like one piece of it that I think is really important for living a full life after loss. Another piece around legacy that I think about a lot is very internal. You know, like who was my mom as a person? What were the values that she held most dear, that she worked really hard to instill in my sister and I in the time that we had together? And how do I live those values? Like, how do I lean into those values? How do I pass them along to my son Bennett, you know, this grandchild who she's never met, even though he says all the time that he knows her, which is hilarious. And then the third piece are like the different external things. So in my case, you know, I did start the nonprofit and I wrote the book, etc. But the ones that matter most to me are actually like the smaller things. You know, my mom made pancakes no matter how sick she was most Sundays. Like maybe not every Sunday, because sometimes she really couldn't get out of bed, but most Sundays she made pancakes. So the week that we launched Grief is Love, on that Sunday, we gave Bennett pancakes for the first time. We talk about her a lot. You know, like that's how Bennett knows her. We don't just talk about her, but like I wanted him to have some agency and ownership around her and his own relationship with her. So for him, it's Grandma Lisa. Like for me, it's my mom. For him, it's Grandma Lisa. And it's Grandma Lisa was Pop Pop's wife. You know, like that's kind of like how we frame it for him and just keep her alive in his mind. And it seems to be working. But, you know, at the end of the day, I realized we feel so much pain from grief because of the love that we continue to share with people. And the reason why we feel so much pain is because love is both feeling and action. And while I can continue to feel loved by my mother, she's not here to act on it. You know, she's not here to help me take care of Bennett. She's not here to give me like recipe X, Y, or Z. She's not here to take my husband's side when we're having an argument. You know, like she's not here for any of those things, and that is what makes it hard. And I think we make it easier on ourselves by identifying our own individual ways of continuing that love, no matter what
Mm.
it looks like.
Oh, so I was like, okay, this will be the promo. I always choose like a little part to put in the beginning, like the little intro kind of promo before, and I'm like, this will be it. Like, but now I'm like, it's long. I'm like, how am I gonna? It's so good. Now with Matt, let's talk about Matt because you met him a few years after your mom
Mhm.
had died. So how did you come to that part within yourself of being ready to love again? And also if you can talk about that part, well, love again, I mean, you still live, but to love someone after your mom had died and
Yeah.
to know that there, because you mentioned that aspect of fear of losing is always kind of there when you've already lost somebody you love, and that fear of losing. So how did you kind of crack open that shell and allow his love back in and your love back out?
I was a basket case. Let me lead with that. I am prone to anxiety when things aren't quite right, and so we became close really quickly. We moved in together really quickly, and almost immediately I had horrible anxiety and was like, "Oh my god, did I make a mistake?" I knew that I didn't, but I was like, why am I freaking out? Like, this is really weird. And so I took myself to therapy again and only met with this woman for maybe 3 sessions. But she basically helped me see how it would be much easier for me to not let someone in and to just keep it moving and date casually and focus on my career, and that was one path that I could take in this life, or I could figure out what I needed to do to get comfortable fully letting someone in, knowing that at some point I'm going to lose them, you know, whether at the time like the relationship might not work out or they're going to die. or I'm going to die. You know what I mean? Like that's just life. And so I realized in that moment, like I had a choice to make. I could either just keep to myself indefinitely and continue to love on the people who were already in my life, or I could open up to new people and new experiences. And this experience of, at the time, I thought the relationship I was in was one that could last for a long time. Um, I felt like if I were to choose the former and walk away from this relationship with Matt, that would be not only doing a disservice to myself, but it would also be doing a disservice to the person that my mother raised me to be. And so I decided to get my shit together. And now we've been living together for almost 12 years and married for almost 9. And we have Bennett. So it all worked out. But it was not pretty. I can remember, this is so ridiculous. I can remember this one fight because I was super anxious and just not in a great place. So it was very easy for me to pick fights about just about anything, and it was really easy for me to end up in a place where he just was on my nerves, even if he didn't do a single thing wrong. And he was driving me nuts, and I didn't have like anywhere to go or any way to hide. I was like in the middle of making dinner, and so I literally just stood in the refrigerator, like with the refrigerator door open, my head as far in the refrigerator as possible, just to like cool off and try to get myself together.
You
And
sound like what women do with hot flashes, by the way.
oh,
That
oh yeah, no, that's real. That's real. Those are real. Those are real.
Okay, sorry.
Oh my God. I was so
So
mad. And
mad.
I don't even know, like, I don't even think he did anything. Like, I don't even remember what I was mad about. But I just remember being so mad and my head being in the refrigerator. And he said, "Are you just going to hide in the refrigerator all night?" And I was like, okay, okay. I need to keep taking baby steps forward and get it together so that I can stay in this relationship. I was going to say, I will add, Matt became a really big part of me figuring out, what it looks like to continue my relationship with my mom and how he could encounter her and, what were some of the things that we could do together to really lean into her legacy.
That's
So
actually
he
what I was
became a
gonna
big
ask
part
you.
of that.
That's what I was gonna ask you is how did you then start introducing her? And especially when he hadn't met her or
Yeah.
somebody understanding the array of emotions that even go in grief when you're with someone else that maybe has not experienced something similar, like how do they accompany an individual in that journey of grief too? So how beautiful that he even was the one to like say, okay,
Oh,
how
yeah.
do we incorporate it?
Oh yeah, he leaned into it. And I think a big part of what made it work, and this is something I think is important in relationships, especially when there are significant differences between you and your partner. He was quick to acknowledge that he didn't know exactly what I was experiencing. And that was really important to me. It was also important to me, later in 2020, as we all watched the murder of George Floyd, for
Mhm.
him as a white guy from Green Bay, Wisconsin, to acknowledge that, he doesn't understand that experience either. Like, I think that acknowledging that we can't fully understand someone else's pain opens up the door to them feeling more comfortable sharing that pain with you, I think.
Mm. Well, that is so well, that's honesty there, which is in the chapter of Ask, you talk
Yeah.
about the importance of honesty and even just the honesty of knowing that even what you know or what you yeah, like you what you
Yeah.
don't know, I mean,
Yeah.
what you don't know what to do. Even when you're accompanying somebody that's grieving, Marissa, like how do I really don't know how to hold space for you right now. I want to let you know that I'm here for you as you're going through your mom's death, but I don't know what to do. So guide me if there's any way, right? Even as a right?
Yeah. Yeah. And "I'm here for you" is a way of holding space, by the
Mhm.
way. I'm like, let me just throw that out there. So yeah, so him acknowledging that he was never going to fully get it because of the unique relationship that I had with my mom was a big part then of me feeling comfortable sharing more with him. And then he just really insisted on bringing the joyful parts of my relationship with my mom back to life, because there was still a lot of sadness at the
Mm.
time when I met him. And so through his support, we actually started an annual tradition, a holiday party called Tacos and Baby Jesus, in honor of my mom. She was a big Christmas person. Like, she might be buying Christmas presents for like this Christmas now. And so we get people to dress up in ridiculous holiday costumes. We do a cookie swap because she was an epic baker. And we do some sort of charity drive as well, usually for a bank or something like that locally. And that is one of the ways that we have come up together to honor her. Another thing, my mom loved lilies. Stargazer lilies were her favorite, and they were all over the funeral. So for years, I couldn't accept flowers from people because it would
Mm.
just remind me of a funeral, and like I didn't want to have anything to do with them. And then a few years ago, maybe like 5 or so years ago, Matt suggested that we plant them in our backyard in DC. And I wasn't ready. And so I said, absolutely not. And then a year later, I decided on my own, and I'm using air quotes for folks who are listening, to plant them in our yard. And it was so amazing. Like, the blooms were gorgeous. They came up like perfectly. And I'm not somebody who has a green thumb either. So she was definitely involved in that one.
Hmm. No, just you said so many things. Like, you shared about legacy, you shared about a way of being able to do things on your own terms
Yeah.
too. Like, people may share ideas of what worked in their grief, and maybe that doesn't work in your grief
Or maybe
yet.
you're not
Maybe it will
ready.
work, and
Yeah.
maybe or
Yeah.
maybe it won't. But it's just something that could be helpful. Before we kind of close off, share with us, because one of the chapters is about care and self care. Having been a caretaker for so long yourself to her as she was sick, how did you then also shift that aspect of self care for yourself? And what were some of these ways in which you did?
Lord, I'm still working on it. To be honest, I think that's something I'll probably be working on for the rest of my life. I am someone who has a really hard time taking care of herself and not feeling like it is something selfish. I know now that it is not, but it's still just something I struggle with. Being a caretaker is my default mode. I think a lot of us are wired that way as women. And as someone who helped take care of somebody else, since I was 13 years old, it's just a really hard mindset to break out of. And there are elements of caretaking that I do enjoy, or at least that I think I enjoy, but I don't even really know anymore, just because it's a role that I've been in for such a long time. But what I have committed to is being mindful about what I need and doing as much as possible to care for myself. If for nothing else, I want to provide a different model for Bennett, and I want to honor my mom in that way. She was always looking out for me and my sister and my dad, no matter how sick she was. She passed away on February 28th, 2008. My dad and I are 25 years apart, almost exactly, like within a few days, basically. And before my mom died, and she was in a place where she was no longer undergoing treatment for her cancer or her MS. She, in the months before she died, was so sick that she battled tuberculosis and pancreatitis and like all sorts of other terrible infections and awful things. And yet, she was trying to plan a surprise joint 25th and 50th birthday party. And I didn't find out about it until right before my actual birthday. She was in the hospital and just, it didn't come together. But she had managed to get these custom candy bars made like for the party, because that's how much of a planner she was. And last week, when I was going through some of like my box of old mom stuff, I found one of those chocolate bars. It's probably so nasty.
Oh, okay. What did it look like? Because I was thinking of like the little M&Ms. Sometimes people can put like, what does this one
No,
look
this
like?
was old school, girl, because this was back
Okay.
in 2008. It looks like a traditional like Hershey's chocolate bar, like just like
Mm-hmm.
flat and basic. And then the wrapper is all customized with all of this birthday stuff, like the celebration of the century, Sam and Marissa, like this whole thing. I'm like,
Oh,
oh my God, you were planning a big party. So yeah, she was
wow.
special.
Yeah, because that was, yeah, you were a quarter of a century old. Your dad was turning half a
He was
century, and
like, this
she wanted
is
to
going to
make
be
sure to
the party.
acknowledge that. And
Yeah.
apart, and yes, definitely do not, and make sure Bennett does not find that chocolate and end up eating that stale piece
So
of chocolate. It's
gross.
probably white now
Oh my
inside.
God. It's disgusting. It's
But you got to
disgusting.
keep it. You got to keep it just for the fact that if
Oh
not,
my
keep the wrapper,
goodness.
right?
That's
But that's good.
a
Like
good
if it,
idea. Why didn't I throw out the chocolate bar? Why do I still have the bar and the wrapper? It's so gross. Okay.
it's okay. It's
Okay.
okay. Yeah, it's
I'm
just you
glad
don't
we're
want it to
talking about
melt
this.
somewhere. You're not
Yeah.
living in Texas where I live, which it could melt. So
Yeah.
that would be really gross. So
Yeah.
at least it's not that. Okay, so is there anything I have not asked you that you want to make sure that you share with the audience? And then we will, of course, talk about how people can get your book. But any other thing regarding grief that you'd like to share with the audience?
The one thing that I usually get asked, and I think it is an important thing to share, is how do I show up when somebody loses someone they love? What can I do? What can I say? And I'm telling you this as a person who's written a lot of words on grief and loss. There is nothing that you can say that is going to really make them feel better when the worst thing in the world has just happened. So worry less about your words and more about your actions. And I put actions into three buckets. So the first is just the holding space. When Matt and I found out about our pregnancy loss, like we couldn't even talk about it that day. But three of my roommates from college who live locally all descended on our house with whiskey and homemade chocolate chip cookie dough, and we watched American Ninja Warrior, which is so random but highly entertaining and distracting. Nobody talked about it. Nobody even asked like how we were doing, because they knew it was we didn't have any words yet. All we could do was sit and watch a silly TV show and drink booze, frankly. And that, like, just being with us while we were in it was so incredibly meaningful. And the next thing on the list is do something practical. We know from science and the research that grief has a really meaningful and tangible impact on our bodies and our brains, because your brain is literally going through a process to make sense of the loss that has just occurred. And because of that, it means you are much more limited in terms of your mental capacity for dealing with other things. And so drop off a meal, ideally something that can be frozen, send Seamless or Uber Eats gift cards, pick up their kid from school, walk the dog, send a cleaner to their house, take a work project off their plate, do something practical to show them that you care and to lessen the burden of just everyday life on them. And then the last one, and this is one of my favorites, do something or give them something that brings them some joy, something that reminds them maybe of their person or just of who they are outside of this moment. So when we had our pregnancy loss, a good friend, the same friend who was with me down in the basement of the investment bank every day for months, she sent a care package from this amazing, amazing cheese shop that we both love in New York City. And she was like, now that you're not pregnant, you don't have any rules about what cheese you can and can't eat. I know other people are going to send bottles of wine, and this is my contribution. And
Mm.
it was so random, but so delicious and so helpful. And again, made me smile because it was reminding me of my life outside of this tragedy. Another girlfriend sent, this is also ridiculous. I really do have the best friends.
Mm.
She sent a package from Amazon with 50 individual taco stands so that I would be encouraged to still host the tacos and baby Jesus party that year.
Oh,
I know, they're good.
oh.
I have a really good crew. I have a really good
Man, they
crew.
need
I
to
know.
write like a list of all these ideas
I
because sometimes
know.
it's like, we're like, what do
I
I
know.
send?
I'm gonna tell
This
you
is
the big
so
thing they
good.
did, they partnered up. These are my roommates from college. We're 12 type A, maybe one that's not type A, but 12 really intense, get after it kind of girls. And they combined financial resources with one of my childhood friends and gave us a gift certificate to the Four Seasons,
Wow.
because the whole time we were in the IVF process, you know, it was like, this is our last shot. This is our last embryo. Like, it has to work. It has to work. But if it doesn't work, I told everybody we were just going to run away from home. And so they gave us the extra push to run away from home for a little bit, which is exactly what we did.
What an amazing group of people, how
I
creative
know.
they
I
are,
know. They're
and
so
how
good.
well they knew you. Because that's the
I
thing, they
know.
knew you. They knew that the taco stands would be,
Yeah.
because I was like, if I get, like, oh, like, what do I need this for? But then it
Yeah.
was in order for you to continue your mom's legacy with the tacos for Jesus. Is that correct? Yes.
Tacos and baby Jesus.
Take
Hmm.
talk as a baby Jesus. Wonderful. So, Marissa, now let's share with the audience where they can get your book. We tried to not give everything away here with this conversation. Hopefully, people are still intrigued. I know they will be to be able to dive into the book because, again, each of these chapters will not only give you background about what you yourself experienced, but again, giving palpable moments and information for
Yep.
the reader. So, how do we get Grief is Love?
You can find Grief is Love wherever books are sold. I'm very fortunate. There's still a number of independent bookstores that carry it. If you want to head to Bookshop and buy it there, Target, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, all of the places. And you can find me on Instagram as Marisa Renee Lee, or head over to my website, which is marisareneelee.com, and sign up for my newsletter.
Wonderful. And all those links will be below in the show notes. And I again thank you, Marissa, for taking time to share about your journey here with me and the audience. It was a joy talking to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you again so much for choosing to listen today. I hope that you can take away a few nuggets from today's episode that can bring you comfort in your times of grief. If so, it would mean so much to me if you would rate and comment on this episode. And if you feel inspired in some way to share it with someone who may need to hear this, please do so. Also, if you or someone you know has a story of grief and gratitude that should be shared so that others can be inspired as well, please reach out to me. And thanks once again for tuning in to Grief, Gratitude, and the Gray in Between podcast. Have a beautiful day.